So thank you for that intro. If any of you are driving up or down 95 or going through the Mid-Atlantic, we'd love to host you for one of our rehearsals, Rumput or Raga Kusuma, when we start rehearsing face-to-face, which will hopefully be sometime soon. We've been rehearsing through Zoom, kind of one way, with my family playing here and people playing at home with their own instruments. So I think we're sick of Zoom. So when it's safe, we're hoping we could play together. Okay, so I'm going to talk about temporality in Balinese music. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes with the examples, and I'll be sharing my screen to show a PowerPoint presentation for most of that, including some audio. And then if folks want to ask questions or discuss issues, we can do that. This is going to be pretty informal. So I remember reading Colin McPhee's Balinese music as a student at Simon's Rock when I was like 17 or something in 1992. And I read Parch's Genesis of a Music at the same time. And I remember thinking that Parch's music looked a lot more interesting. I couldn't really find recordings of Balinese music at that little school. And so all I had to go on at the very beginning were McPhee's transcriptions. And then I got obsessed with Indian music for a while. And it wasn't until the mid-90s that I kind of took a chance trip to Indonesia and eventually ended up in Bali. And I just couldn't believe that what I was hearing was the music that I had studied in these transcriptions. It seemed to me that most of what I found most compelling in those performances wasn't there on the page. Now, I was doing a lot of jazz drumming at that time back home in Kansas City. And, you know, for guys my age at that time, playing jazz meant trying to do really hard things to a purely metronomic pulse. And I was just really blown away by what the Balinese were doing with time, right? Complicated, elegant tempo changes while maintaining super tight interlocking patterns without a conductor, and incredibly subtle timing independent of periodic tempo in Kebiar passages. And even that moment of the single 2D moment of the biar at the beginning of a biar, just the way they did that was just really blowing my mind. And I don't mean to knock McPhee, right, this founding father, but to say that the technology that he was using, standard Western notation, just didn't seem optimized or tuned for representing and analyzing much of what I thought was so unique to Balinese music, and what it seemed that my teachers kept redirecting me towards. I mean, every representational technology is going to both reveal and obscure. But, you know, after spending more time in Bali and studying and interviewing folks, I really came to feel that standard Western notation misses a lot of what is at issue for Balinese artists, as revealed in the way they kind of critique each other or praise each other, right, and describe musicians and ensembles. And I remember sitting in the Kasira Narwa hall at EC with Dewa Alit once, and I know Dewa's Alit's music was recently discussed on the series. And we were listening to a rehearsal of a Japanese group, Kebiar group, that was going to play that night at the Bali Arts Festival. And they were just fantastic. I mean, just amazing. And we had just started planning a tour for the New York group to come that year. And hearing this Japanese group, I felt totally defeated. I wanted to like email back and be like, no, there's just no point in another foreign group coming here and attempting this. And I even asked Alit, I said, like, if you close your eyes, would you even know that this wasn't a Balinese group? And, you know, without missing a beat, he was like, of course. And I said, well, but their kotekan is so tight and they're playing so fast. And Alit said, Bayu, you know, their breath, their energy, their ombak, their waves, right, of tempo and dynamics. And their mutab, it just isn't the same. And that reminded me of my first experiences hearing Balinese music live, performed in Bali, and the ways analyzing and transcribing this music in Western notation, which I often found myself doing to kind of as a mnemonic, can pull us away again and again from, I think, what are really central issues in the music. So one reason why I think Bayu and Ombak we call this fluid structure, are so central in Balinese music is because it's an expression of the tightness, of the compactness of feeling in an ensemble. It is the sound of a tightly coordinated community. And I think many Balinese listeners take it as a sign and maybe an indication of the health of that community. And so I worked over the past few years to try to represent and analyze these aspects of the music, partly in order to try to help my students and myself understand what many Balinese artists often describe to me as crucial to their art, but that I found was often obscured in my own notations of that art. I remember having, and this has happened several times, like transcribing a drum part, transcribing a part for someone, really talented musician, and they play the part, and within the context of the notation, they're playing the part completely correctly, but it's all wrong. Because they weren't attending to, or they did not yet understand, the drum's special role, or the ugal's special role in shaping omba and bayu, pushing a little bit here, pulling a little bit there. But if you put all that in notation, you'd turn the whole page black, right, with indications. And I think many of us in Balinese Gamelan in the States have had the experience of trying to accommodate really talented musicians, really trained in Western music, who want to transcribe their parts and read from them. And I find that no matter how good they are as readers, that notation can get them like 90% of the way there almost immediately, really, really fast. But then it seems to keep them from getting 100% of the way there, because it can't represent the subtleties of group feeling. And until they put the notation away and focus on cultivating a group feeling of feeling with others, I think they're actually going to keep the group from realizing their potential in that way. So, and I think especially in the absence of a Balinese drummer, American groups really need to be careful about this. And it's something that any group can work on. Not every group can play Trunajaya at tempo, but every group can work on the subtleties of ensemble feeling, no matter what repertoire you're working on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the analytical and visualization techniques I've used to try to understand this aspect of Balinese gamelan music. And I should say that this is pretty stale work. I did most of it 5 or 8 years ago. I've used the same techniques more recently to analyze Afro-Cuban music, as well as some other time series data that I'll talk about at the very end. And if you want to see more in-depth articles related to the issues I'm talking about, you could just look for my name and I'd look on the online Analytical Approaches to World Music Journal. It's free, there's no firewall. You could also get my book. I talk about some of these issues in that 2013 book, Radical Traditions, which you can get on Amazon. But first, I want us to listen to an example. I could pick a million examples, but this one just came up in my iTunes, and I think it's just really, really gorgeous. It's Pat Lo Tring's Ginder Wayang Ensemble playing Alasa Rum. So it's part of the overture of the traditional Wayang, and it's from the Bali 1928 reissue that Ed Herbst put together. It's 3 minutes long, like all of those cuts had to be 3 minutes long. But let's listen to all of it and really try to listen for that fluidity in timing and dynamics. So this is the part where I'm going to try to share my screen and not lose you and share audio. now? Can you hear me talk?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. I hope everybody could hear that. I'm sure it was even more exciting through kind of Zoom latency. It's been interesting to try to do Kronchong rehearsals also through Zoom. And, you know, we have all these irama shifts. And now I think we're a lot better at it because Zoom is constantly speeding us up and slowing us down more than would normally be the case. Okay, so I'm going to shift over to the PowerPoint. Okay, so I was interested in trying to get into some of these issues of Bayou. Let me go back, make sure I didn't skip anything. So that example that I just played might have been a bit of an extreme example of the issues that I'm talking about, since it's just for musicians and they aren't bound by a gong structure. So what I want to show you is a much, much simpler, about as simple as it can get, example to talk about these issues of fluidity in larger ensemble music. Okay, so I was interested in trying to get hyper detailed with an analysis of time, both at the kind of micro timing level and at the larger macroscopic level. And one of the issues was getting really clear onset data. It would be impossible to pull that out of a mastered recording. So I started making recordings with little sensors on individual keys, all running into multi-track field recorders. It's a lot of cables. And so the example I'm going to look at here, looks like it's cropping part of the image, is a very short piece called Bapang Silasir. It's hardly a piece. It's often usually included as a suite in larger pieces. And here's a standard Western notation transcription of it. The chalong, this is front weighted. G is gong, the plus is tong in the middle. So 5, 6, 2, 6 on the chalong, and then the for the polos. The saxi, so really, really simple. So within standard Western notation, it just looks like this thing, kind of trapped by repeat signs, as if it was just that literal thing over and over again. But you listen to a recording, and there's all of this linear transformation, and we could represent that just one-dimensionally. Here is just the onsets of the katuk, and you see a lot of transformation in it. You see it looks like they go into double time in the middle, and then there's this push and pull at the end, and then it slows down. But this doesn't show us very much, it doesn't give us a sense of form. And we can represent it in 2 dimensions with tempo, beats per minute on the y-axis, and time, track timing along the x-axis. And then we kind of highlights this linear transformation, but we still don't have a sense of metric or phrase structure. And what I want to point out here is both standard Western notation and traditional Balinese notation, which is not descriptive notation. It's really a kind of mnemonic notation. So here's the Aksara notation. If anyone ever needed it for Bapang Silasir, I don't know if anyone ever would, but it's end-weighted. But both kind of encourage an understanding of Balinese music as a homology of this social, historical, cosmic, non-processive, steady state. Essentially, this kind of pre-modern, almost primitivist version of Balinese culture, and here are some quotes along those lines. I do want to play an example. Here's a short example of just the very end of one of the ensembles playing this. And it'll give you a sense of the kind of variation and how much more is in there than is in the standard Western notation version. We could have notated all of that in standard Western notation, but I'm trying to get at issues that really aren't a good fit for Western notation. So I'm asking what representational mode would be most appropriate for visualizing the enlivening tension and dynamism between linear transformation over time of even very short cyclical pieces and this sense of return that's undeniably there. And so I started experimenting with a kind of helical representation of time. So here is just the Chalong onsets on what we could call the half note scale, and it's highlighted in the notation above, and then it's represented in three dimensions below, and there's the kind of basic trigonometry below that, if you want to look at that. But I was interested in the ways in which my teachers were talking about how things get tight, how they compress, how they open up, right, in space, how they turn around. And I thought that a kind of helical model would get us closer to the kinds of descriptions I was hearing my teachers use. So time is going like this, and here you can see, this is in the example from Pinda. They switch to double time in the middle, and you see that compression, and then they slow to the final gong, which we just heard in that example, okay? And then we can, I'm doing all of this in Mathematica. Then we can put a skin on it, and we can kind of see more clearly when things are compressed and when they're opening up. And we're starting to see gestures there, okay? So it tightens at these angsals, and you can see even the double angsal followed by the to really kind of push us towards the end. And then we can plot, because I've got all of the instruments individually recorded with their own onset data, we can plot all those individual instruments on that helix. So here are the gong. So they start at the left, and the last gong is on the right. And then we can start putting in the polos. It's also highlighted in red above. Then we can put the sangsi on. Those are green, okay? Then I started playing around with actually taking an amplitude picture of it and then mapping that on the structure. And then we can see how time might interact with loudness. So one thing we see is that the katuk was very close to the mic. So you see the katuk has its own kind of loudness band along the top. But we see this kind of, it getting kind of hot before an angsal and then cooling down after an angsal, just in terms of loudness. And that correlates with a compression and then a release of the time, okay? Doing it this way also allows us to really zoom in and look at micro timing as well. So what you could do is you can write a grid onto the structure. You have to peg it to something. So here, I think it's pegged to the Chalong. So that will divide the division. It will divide the space between each Chalong into a rational grid, okay, an equidistant grid. And then you can see how things might be pushing or pulling relative to that grid, okay? It would all change when you change the instrument to which you're pegging the grid. And then you can zoom in. So then you can see, for instance, that in this example, the sangsi, which is green, tends to get there on shared notes a bit before the polos with these musicians that I happen to record. And then that's part of just the feel of that ensemble, of that recording. So we're seeing the fluidity of the overall time, pushing and pulling, but we're also seeing this like lilt, the groove of the interaction, the kind of micro timing interaction between the musicians, okay? And then we can look down essentially the tunnel of the helix, and we essentially get a kind of histogram of the timing. So on the left, the gong is determining the equidistant grid, and so things are kind of looser relative to that. And then on the right, the Chalong, the half note, defines it, and so you see that the Chalong are right on 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock, but then you see how relative to that the gangsa may be pushing or pulling. Okay, so what we could then do is take that kind of information. Oh, I'm going to talk about something else quickly. What we can do also is look at a sense of space or a sense of volume that's produced by the different instruments. So here, I've represented the kind of volume, the spaciousness of the gong cycle, in which is nested a Chalong density, in which when they go to double time in this recording is nested the katuk, because the katuk goes to twice its previous density when they go to double time. You can see how these all relate in this kind of visualization. And then that would also help us see how the gong, the volume, the gong structures can change even if the tempo remains the same. So in this recording, they are playing what some people call the ngalik. This is the Sudamani version. They're playing the ngalik in Bapang Silisi. And they've just stretched it out so there's only one gong for the entire ngalik. I don't know if that's standard, but that's how they did it, even though the tempo is going along at the same time. So you can have this sense of the tempo being stable, but now being in this kind of larger gong space. So back to that kind of lilt stuff. You could then take the placement along the grid of those individual players and put them in a histogram and then kind of compare them within a full performance or across performances. So here, green is the sangsi, red is the polos, the middle shading is where they're showing up together. To the left of 0, 0 would be the grid defined by the chalong is arriving early, and to the right is arriving a little bit late. Okay, and then you can kind of zoom out to look at full performances. And then I think we're getting a sense of like why this performance of the same piece at a groove level, even if they structure the gong differently, feels different between this village or that village. Okay, Sudamani happens to be very tight. Okay, and if you look at like Perion, they're polos players, right? They're all just a little bit behind relative to the chalong. And then we could compare that also with the kind of volume representation of their gongs. Okay. And one thing that I think we could imagine this to represent is how, oh, that's a little blue, I'll get there in a minute, is how musical time can come to function as an icon of that particular community. How it's not just the tuning of that gamelan in that village, it's not just the repertoire, but it's the way they structure time in that community that's also distinctive and can be recognized as symbolizing that community. All of the code and all of the math, blah, 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 can be used with really any kind of periodic data set. So here is that famous Puspawarna recording from the non-such on Voyager, whatever it is. Time is going left to right. Okay, so in the left image, you see the relative kind of volumes of the balongan, smallest helix, and then the katuk, and then the gong. And then going to the right, you see how it really slows down at the end. It looks a little like some carvings at Candi Cheto. Is that the right Candi? The fun thing you could do pedagogically for undergraduate students is now that you have all of these things, you can print them out because 3D printers. So it just kind of helps people literally get into their hands some of the issues with timing that I'm talking about when I'm going to pass these around the classroom and have people play with them. And you can zoom in or you could do the full structure. These are really dated. I feel weird holding this. These are really dated, and I'm sure that that you could do a lot more with 3D printers now. One other thing I wanted to talk about was comparing this mode of visualizing time and structuring compositions to some other metaphors that I was hearing my teachers use. So in developing these helical versions, I was inspired by the ways my teachers described how their music, flowed or went around or got compressed or got tighter. But I also wanted to compare it to other metaphors like the trianga, right? This refers to the tripartite body that is used in describing composition or in teaching composition at EC. In terms of being kind of rationally organized as a head, the kawitan, the trunk, the pangawak, and the feet, the pangachet, or cognates of those terms. And it was clear to me, just listening to the caviar, that I was hearing all the time, that it was really kind of a tortured exercise to fit Kebiar into that structure. And I think Michael Tinsley's book or Patty Sandino's master's thesis are really, really good examples about showing how it's a lot more complicated than any kind of simple tripartite structure. But I also didn't feel when I was performing these works, like Sam Lalambatan, that the proportions or the relative volumes of those pieces kind of mapped the metaphor. So I wanted to represent it this way to kind of compare these. I think this is of Lalambatan Pat Jagul from Wayne Vitale's wonderful SDSI recording. So time is going from top to bottom here, and you're seeing the kinds of helices that you saw in those earlier examples. So just the opening, the Tabu Tulu is that section. You've got the fast tempo and then a slow tempo, and then it opens up with a very long gong transition that we can call the shoulders if we want to kind of expand the metaphor. And then it goes into the pangamak, the tabu pat, and then another transition, and then it's got the tabu talu, which is considerably long. But it didn't really feel like a body to me. I felt more like I was in differently shaped volumes. I'm going to over-labor the point. We could play around with imagery here. Okay, I want to go to one more example about timing in Balinese music, and that's the kebiar, the biar of a kebiar. So the biar refers to this kind of lightning hit at the beginning of a piece that's just this tutti hit. Theoretically, everybody's playing together. Here's an example of a biar from the Jaga Raga ensemble I recorded. That's it, right? But we know it's not a simultaneity, right? These aren't robots, and even if they could do it, I don't think they do it. So here's a synthesized example of a totally simultaneous biar with samples. It's just not the same thing. And I remember having conversations with musicians asking, like, could you tell that there was that ensemble just from the biar? Some people felt they could, some people felt that they couldn't. And so I did a little project on this, kind of just analyzing this one Balinese musical moment between different villages. It's not a simultaneity, right? It's really, really quick, with most instruments playing about 10 microseconds within each other. But it has a particular temporal profile, right? A few instruments enter first, and then the bulk are in the middle, and then some trail off. And each village that I recorded had a distinct temporal profile. We recorded a whole bunch and averaged them to kind of see how these grouped. If we look at this, Pengosakan Sudamani was again the most kind of temporally compact, but they had their own idiosyncrasies as well. If we look at Pinda, they're kind of the most diffuse, right? And then if we look at the individual instruments that are played within the biar, we see these kind of patterns, right? So in Jaga Raga, the kendang tended to be out in front. So that's here. In Sudamani, the ugal tended to be out in front. In Jaga Raga, the gong tended to be late. In Gladag, and all of them, the ching ching was kind of right in the middle of it. In Gladag, it was like really, really super tight. And these are just differences in feeling that that represent that community. Here's one last example. How they perform Rayong. Okay, so in this figure, the red 45-degree line represents a theoretically simultaneous hit, right? Where the right and the left hand would play together. And overall, most of the Rayong players in each ensemble tended to strike with their left and right hands, near simultaneously, indicated by the proximity to the points on those, to that red line. But the actual trend of right and left hand strikes for each ensemble is shown by the black line. So for all ensembles, except for Pinda, there's this close alignment between actual and ideal. But the overall profile for Pinda shows that the Rayong onsets tend to be kind of diffuse. And Pengosakan is different. These are really, really fine differences, but they contribute again to this feeling in time between the different groups. And it may be a feeling that we can't really explain in explicit terms. They just feel different in the way that a lot of musicians or non-musicians have a hard time describing spectral differences between the same pitch. They can feel it, but they don't really have a vocabulary for it. Okay, so I'm going to take a real hard turn here for the last two slides. I hope this isn't too far out of left field, but it's much fresher stuff. It's going to be a hard left turn. So as I said, most of this work is several years old at this point. And more recently, I've been working on what might appear to be really, really different projects. And that's a relationship between sound and ethics and law in Richmond, Virginia. That's really different. But this project has entailed working with actually what feels like pretty similar time series data and working on ways to kind of explore it and visualize it similar to these projects on music data from Bali, right? To see patterns that exist in a time series but wouldn't be evident necessarily in Excel, in a spreadsheet. So here's a visualization. This is a time animated map of noise complaints in Richmond with a demographic layer showing African-American density by blue shading. I'm going to show this to you. It's very, very short, but know before I show this to you that a noise complaint can originate with an officer on duty, okay? And that the noise ordinance was recrafted in 2011 to a very low threshold. So this is a YouTube video. Let me see if I can open it. Watch, that sounds reasonable. Watch, that didn't do it. Okay, let me copy it and put it in a new window. Okay, I'm going to show you one more thing, but I want to describe what you just saw. So what you see in that shift from the scatter plot of complaints throughout the city at the beginning of the animation to these like straight hard lines on the border of in and on the border of Black neighborhoods is essentially sonic stop and frisk. So these are police pretext stops for loud African-American car stereo systems, which can then lead to arrests on other charges. So I'm going to show you one more visualization. This is from last week. And here are the flight paths of the 6 Virginia State Police aircraft surveilling the Black Lives protests in Richmond since nightly, since May 29th. So remember that Richmond is the former capital of the Confederacy with the most Confederate statues. And these flights are visualized. So I've taken this timing data and I've mapped it and I've visualized it by average decibels on the ground. Because I'm hearing these things every night. A lot of people are. And what we're mostly seeing are aircraft probably running Stingray to scoop up cell phone data, circling around protesters at the Lee statue at the end of Monument Avenue. So I'm going to show you this one. And this will be my last slide. So, and this continues nightly. I think what's strange here, as I've been digging into this project, is like the Balinese musical data, this time series data also reveals information about a community, right? In this case, I'm essentially visualizing a carceral soundscape in which the analysis of sonic patterns in time can show how a particular community is oppressed. What I'm showing in the Balinese music data sets is how a particular community comes together in sound. I hope that's not too far into left field for you or too much of a strained comparison. One thing I've just discovered and that I don't have together enough to show you is that I can take all of the Balinese musical data and map it into an imaginary space using the same program as the mapping data, and do all kinds of things with that. So all my research is going around and around. Okay, I'll stop there. And if folks have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or respond to them.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was really cool. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump into the chat box, and we will call on you in the order that those get put in there.
Oscar Smith has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Oscar.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for that. It's really, really interesting. I wonder if you have any theories about why there are microtimings in particular places in a Gamelan or something. Is it because of the particular shape of the kotekan that means that a polos or sangsi plays a little bit early or late or something?
Yeah, I suspect that part of it is ergonomics. I would like to compare microtiming between a 5-tone kibira gangsa and one with a samaradana where they've got to skip keys, and to see if the resolution of differences that I'm talking about are occurring at that level. I think it has a lot to do with gestures kind of going through the ensemble and anticipations towards a structural point, or maybe getting ahead of the drummer, thinking that what the drummer's about to do. I feel like I'm seeing that sometimes in the data. But to just say simply, I think a lot's going on that would structure microtiming within any particular piece.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Got a question from Chris Hull next.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Matt. Thanks for organizing this again, Matt. You're doing a great job. Andy, I wrote a bunch of questions down here, but a great segue from what Oscar was just asking you. Hang on, let me collect my thoughts here. So with the contact mics, I assume you'd also pick up information for pukul dua, which I know often will get used in the slower section of something like Selisir, where you're playing a dead stroke as you mute for the interlocking on which like the adjacent part would play. And I wonder if you've maybe looked any closer at how that might inform or play a role in whether the polos or sangsi reads early or late. Because I know from studying classical percussion, and it seems to apply in Balinese music as well, like sometimes what you want is maybe for the sounding note to ring a little bit, to overlap a little bit with the oncoming note. I don't know. Something I was thinking about. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, it is represented in the data, and I don't filter it out. I think I could without too much fiddling. And I think, I don't want to go back through all the slides, but I think in one of the first ones, I think in the Pinda or maybe Sudamani, when they start, it's very, very slow. And some of them started the piece, just said, play it however you play it. And some people they're just jumping out really fast. Sudamani started really slow with filled in notes. And I think you can see that the polos and the sangsi are kind of right on top of each other throughout. And then, you could throw it through a histogram, or you could just visualize it. And I think you can see if there are trends, even in the theoretical simultaneity of the pukul duo when they should be playing together. there are so many different things you could do with the data, so many different questions you can ask that I haven't, and I'm never going to be able to. And I've got tons and tons of pieces. I've got a whole day's worth of a pretty rare Lalambatan, I think, from Jaga Raga in a pretty distinctive style that I've never been able to make time for.
All with the contact mics.
Yeah.
Wow.
So if someone else wants to, work with this data, I'm happy to hand it out. I also recorded way more than I could in Cuba, and Fernando Binadon has been publishing some really wonderful work. Sometimes co-published with me, but more often he just takes it a lot further than I would be able to. So,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it's really amazing. I mean, I had never even conceived of, well, actually, maybe I might have conceived of this kind of helix formation for time, because it makes a lot of sense when you envision cyclical structures that way. But to see it graphically like this was fascinating. And I loved how, just as I was kind of getting excited with one graph you'd show me, then you'd show another one where you've taken it kind of an order of magnitude higher. That was very exciting. But to go back to what you're saying, I mean, yeah, obviously there's so many ways you could interpret this data. And especially when you're comparing sort of the different, you could call them like regional styles from village to village. Speaking of the biar, well, we didn't speak of the biar, but now I'm looking at my notes now. Speaking of the village to village variations, how many samples were you looking at for each of these villages? Like, I assume you're taking more than one reading as a representation of each village?
Yeah, I think I did like 15 keepers from each. And, every village had one that was like, you have to record all evidence of that, And I would record them. I recorded them isolated, which is kind of unnatural, right? Yeah. And I also recorded them like, let's begin Kebiar Ding. And then play into Kebiar Ding a little bit. Or was it Kebiar Ding? I don't remember. But to try to get, more ecological, make it more ecologically valid. But then again, you can always make the argument that some ethnomusicologist showing up at night and asking you to record just part of a piece is not ecologically valid. If you really, really want to understand the essence of a biar, it has to be after they rehearse for 4 months every night, and they're on the PKB stage, and there's 5,000 people screaming. But that's not when you can glue a bunch of sensors onto it.
Exactly. Yeah, with the presence of those mics, they're already maybe behaving differently. Yeah, I wonder what the difference might be between, because obviously there would be a lot of overlap between just analyzing waveform data versus this kind of like notes in time helix graph you've got. And I suppose one thing with the waveform is you can't isolate instruments or individual keys.
It would be, it depends on the recording, but for Balinese ensemble music, it just.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I loved it, and I want to see more someday, but I'll let someone else talk now. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
We got a question from Michael Tenzer.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, Andy. It's a kind of a simple question, actually, but so I've noticed over the years, and I wonder if you have too, that most complete players tend to stay slightly ahead of the beat. And that implies to me that at the moment of the onset that people will try to catch up to the beat. And so how in general does that, and it seems to me that as opposed to jazz, say for example, which is famously behind the beat, which gives an extremely wide latitude for microtiming, it seems to me that in Balinese music you actually have less latitude for microtiming. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, this is something we talk about.
Why do they need to stay ahead of the beat?
I think, I mean, we've all had this experience of a new complete or Kajar player who joins the group and stays in the pocket, or worse. Mm-hmm. And it just, everything, it's like all of the energy has been sucked out of the room. And trying to get them to understand that it's totally paradoxical, but the beat has to be consistently ahead of the beat. If the beat's on the beat, it's ruined. and and try to find ways of saying that makes sense and get people to understand it, rather than just like making them to espressos before a rehearsal.
They have to pull. They have to pull everybody along at every moment.
Yeah, they have to be at the bleeding edge, and if they're in the pocket, it all sinks back. They have to be really out there in front. I think that makes sense for an American group, but the Balinese don't need that, I don't think. And I tend to think of the katuk in Balinese music as something like the drone in Hindustani music, whereas like Ravi Shankar doesn't need the drone to stay in tune. It's there to give contour to his beautiful improvisation. And I feel like the beat is there to let you know what the gong structure is, how beautiful these phrases are relative to it. And I've heard plenty of Sudamani rehearsals where they're playing beautifully, and I didn't notice that for this past minute that the complete player wasn't there. So I admit to still being a bit baffled by its function and its role within really, really professional Balinese musical ensembles. And I know that when I peg the beat to the beat, all of the numbers shift in these graphs. You have to peg it to something to make a visualization.
And I don't understand exactly what you mean. When you peg it to what's actually played or to what the beat should be?
To what's actually played, to a sensor on the kajar.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess there's no way it would be it's a hypothetical space to posit what the actual beat would be.
Right. Unless you take all of the onsets that are theoretically on the beat and you derive a mean.
Yeah.
Would that even be it?
Yeah, I know.
You could do that, but I don't know if you then synthesize that part and played it, which you could do all of this. Yeah. I wonder what a Balinese musician would think of that thing that they heard.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we have a write-in question from Lane, who doesn't have a microphone. Lane asks, what I'm wondering is if the alignment of the BR for any village is the same no matter who in the ensemble are playing the parts.
Yeah, I didn't ask people to shift parts, and they were very particular about who needed to be where. And I remember in a couple of recordings, some people were missing, and it was a bit of a crisis because cues had to go a certain way. And the most important was the kendang and the ugal. And you couldn't just switch those around. Partly because a kendang musician is cueing it for all intents and purposes, or sometimes the ugal musician. That was more often the case, I felt like, in the Sudamani recording, which may explain why the ugal is out there in front. It was more the case, I remember in Jaga Raga. If you just said, okay, everybody get up and move to the left one seat, I'm sure it would sound different. But people develop specialized roles within the gamelan, even if in a lot of gamelan, a lot of people could play a lot of the parts.
Cool. And then we have a question from Bli Putu.
Hey, Putu.
Hey, Bli, Andy, nice to see you. Thank you for that.
You have my favorite earrings in.
That's right. These are the only earrings I own, so they better be here. I just have a brief question. So you touched on this a little bit in response to Michael's question, but with the growing number of gamelan ensembles and gamelan communities outside of Indonesia, would you change anything about your methodology of the sort of helixical analyses to, say, an American gamelan? Because there are becoming these sort of codified regional styles of American gamelan, right? Which I think, Dr. Liz Clendening has done a study on. So yeah. I was wondering if any methodologies would change in looking at gamelan ensembles communities in, say, like North America or something.
I don't know. I mean, I tend to think of this as a pedagogical tool to try to get, especially American listeners, to pay attention to these aspects of the music that that our teachers tell us are really important, but are very hard, I think, for a lot of non-Balinese groups, for Balinese groups, to cultivate. And the printing and some of the visualizations, I find sometimes help because some people tend to be visual, and seeing it in kind of stark terms can help. Then direct attention when we say, okay, now let's listen to it, with that in mind. The Balinese ensembles that I recorded, I went back and took the 3D printed things, and it was fun, but nobody needs it there in Bali. There were long, interesting questions, but no one, to my knowledge, then adjusted their playing based on it or reimagined a new way to play based on it.
All right, next we have a question from Elizabeth Clendening.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hey, Andy. It's always great to hear about all this research. And I guess I had a comment first and then also some related questions. And the comment is that I was really struck in hearing about this time in particular because I've just been teaching intro-level undergraduate world music online. And they had Indonesia week last week, as one does. And what stuck out to me this time was looking at the slide about the history of thinking about, Gamelan music as static, or that that literature about that, and thinking about these models again. And what struck me about this particular group of students who are, this is their first real encounter with any gamelan, was that they picked up on the microtiming. I mean, they didn't call it that, but so many of their comments were focused on not, whatever 4 things are in the book that say they're supposed to listen for, but on that. And so I was curious, I'm certain if I put them with instruments when we practice, they couldn't replicate it, but I was curious if you'd had that experience as a teacher also, and if that says something about sort of the ways that scholarship has been done or these musics have been kind of translated for non-Balinese audiences in the past.
Yes, I've had just total beginning students be able to recognize this, even if they don't have a vocabulary from it. And they usually recognize it in, a little prompt where I say, okay, break into pairs and compose a koteka. You've learned about the basic kind of principles. And then they often come back and they've got some kind of polite version of, she was hard to work with because I kept having to adjust to her, or she didn't realize, or he didn't realize that I was adjusting to them, and they had to switch back and forth. And then I'd say, okay, now, change your pair and try. And they will kind of come back immediately and be like, it's really different to play with different people. Because, sorry, turn my phone off, because of these micro timing issues, and this realization that even as 2 people, you are trying to create a community, and you have to find common time to do that. You have to understand how the other person conceives of time to make that work. Your question about scholarship, I feel like, I don't know if I'm unfair to McPhee, and I want to be clear that I'm kind of describing my encounter with it. And it was partly because I couldn't find them in the library. And what I had in my head was what I heard when I read the transcriptions. And I think things have really changed now that we've, since YouTube, really, since people have really immediate access to this infinite library, that you can kind of go right there and listen to it, and not have to rely on a transcription. A transcription can really become purely analytical rather than being prescriptive for you, which is what it was for me as I was going through McPhee's book.
That's great. Can I ask something else? I don't see anything else popping up yet, which is a bigger, maybe a question that draws in both of these sets of research that you've been working on. Because I think, for me, it's really interesting, how much the visualizations, at least for me, sort of give both new analytical meaning and a new visceral meaning to things that one might already feel is there, which I imagine, you were talking about flying over, all these crafts flying over Richmond, or the idea of Balinese community being there. And I'm wondering if you could just speak more generally about, the usefulness or the potential usefulnesses for these kinds of models, different types of work.
Yeah, I felt a kind of parallel experience when I would hear about things get tight and things expand and there's a breath and there's a wave. And I heard all these words and it's like, well, okay, I'm having a real hard time writing this out in my kind of personal transcriptions. And when I started doing it this way, it was kind of like, wait, there's the wave. There's the compression. That's where it opens up. And that's where it gets, I can point to it. Now we can talk about it. We can see it. I knew it was there. And now I have confirmation, or maybe I've just created an image to confirm my pre-existing beliefs. With the police data, I helped facilitate a studio in the Richmond City Jail, and I would hear the guys in the studio program talk about, getting pulled over by the police because of sound, and hear these stories, and try to get information from the police, not really get anything, and then I did a FOIA, and I got all this data, and I animated it all, and I felt like, wait, I'm seeing what these people were telling me, and now I have this kind of proof of it, this evidence of it, kind of taking it to people who were describing that experience and be like, yes, that's it, that's what I'm talking about. I don't know if people out in the suburbs here really understand the level of surveillance that's happening in Richmond. But when you take the data and you visualize it, it's something for you to point at, and then that can at least lead to a hopefully shared conversation about some phenomena.
There's a follow-up that Oscar Smith wanted to ask.
I was going to ask if you have any data for how the Rayong interlocks and how that compares to Gangsa Kotekan, and given the difference in technique.
I do, and it's super interesting. And again, it's from Jaga Raga, and I just can't. I just don't have the bandwidth. And again, I'll just say, if there's anyone looking for material to work on, I would be happy. I would love to see other people work on it. I do have a lot, and you can imagine the Pengipok of Kebiar Duduk. There's a lot of notes. There's a lot of data to look at, and then comparing that to Gangsa would be a lot of work.
Yeah, because even in just a solo Rayongan from a Kebiar piece, when they move from one position of four pitches to the next one, there's always, seems to me, like some really obvious delay. And of course, there obviously has to be because of the the physical movement. But yeah, it's it'd be cool to see how that compares to different ensembles and that kind of thing.
Right. I've wondered a lot about how ergonomics may structure microtiming at certain thresholds. How, and this is a kind of an elephant in the room, I think, that just the acoustic properties of the instruments affect how time would be structured. And that isn't at all taken account for when you put a sensor on the thing, right? I've got a sensor on the jagogan, on the gong, but those are these big, long waves hit with padded mallets heard from that further part of the gamelan. That's a big issue.
Yeah, maybe I'll contact you and see what I can do with the data.
Be great.
Thanks.
Andy, I actually want to ask you a couple questions. I have two questions, and since I don't know too much about Balinese music, one question is about it, but the other question is about actually the police data. So I was curious if you had any plans to follow up with that police data in any way, maybe give it to people that might be able to use it for some advocacy, because that's fascinating. Just the pre, before and after of changing those laws is pretty wild. Some people I'm sure would love to have that data. And then the other question is a little bit more from I don't know Balinese music that well. In Javanese music, we're talking about rasa all the time, and it comes up in a lot of our conversations, no matter what the topic is. And you're talking about how if you give somebody the notation and they're an excellent Western musician, they can get 90% of the way there, but the last 10% is not really possible just with notation. And it's very similar in Javanese music. So I was wondering if the Balinese, do they use the term rasa, or they some other term to sort of describe this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I hear rasa. I mean, Putu, what else do you hear? I mean, I feel like I hear olfactory metaphors, maybe more in Bali than, I don't know, did Putu go away? Yeah, I mean, that term is used, bawanya. I will think of more the minute we turn this off. And then you have also asked about the police data. Yeah, I was talking with folks at the Virginia ACLU. The data is so, it's not rich data. It would be hard to build a case that would stand up, and they were very interested in it, and other data I've been finding around the city, like racialized prohibitions on certain genres and venues. Really, like, you can't have hip hop here. I mean, that's clearly a civil rights violation. And they were interested in it, but it's really about like what will stand up in a court and what issues are worth the ACLU putting a lot of resources behind. And we were talking about this in George Floyd. And now the ACLU is putting all of its energy, as they should, on a case against the city for the police using flashbangs and tear gas and rubber bullets on many nights against peaceful protesters. So it's really upsetting data. It's interesting, but there's bigger fish to fry.
Cool, thanks, Andy. Chris Hall had another question.
Hello again.
Hi.
Transitioning back to the more Balinese side of things, although I appreciate the input about this police data. I think that's interesting and topical. However, I'm really interested in this idea of comparing this data across different villages and sort of getting a feel for regional styles and how they differ. And one of the things I imagine you could draw out of your data, and I know you're talking about being swamped by it, but I don't know, maybe you've looked at this, is how the rate and duration of sort of the accelerandi and decelerandi differ from village to village. Like, say you're going from, if we're using Silisira as the example, the sort of slow section moving into the faster section, or the faster section moving into that sort of final gong, how the duration of that acceleration or deceleration, and also the sort of rate, how those things might change, and the difference in sort of input speed and output speed, or what have you.
Yeah, that would be pretty easy to do, just how they structure these, this repertoire of gestures. How they prepare for an angsal, how they do the angsal, how they recover from the angsal. That would be, I think, really easy to do. And it would, I think the danger that I find myself falling into is identifying something and then putting a stamp on it. Pinda.
Right.
So the Pinda musicians switch, and they've not had their coffee yet. And I mean, you would have to get a lot of data to really make a statement about a regional style, I think. You'd have to have multiple recordings and have musicians shift, if they do shift, right, in that ensemble.
So perhaps a better laboratory for that might be something like Gender Wayang. If you took I've been watching this series of videos that my Balinese friend is putting out during coronavirus, where he's going around Badung, looking at different Badung Gender maestros just to document them, which is kind of cool. You don't see Balinese people doing that very often. But so let's say something like the way an individual kind of teacher might do a particular ornamentation. I forget the Balinese word, but where you do sort of a skip note. You know, one of my teachers, I learned over time that whenever he plays one of those, it's always way ahead of the beat. And that's almost like a reverse sort of agogic accent, where he's almost shortening it so that it draws it out. It draws it to your attention more. It stands out of the texture. Maybe that would be more manageable. I don't know, than monitoring a whole group across many recordings.
Yeah, I think technically it'd be easier to deal with the data. I love getting to Wayang. I play a lot of, and one of the reasons that I played that Alasa room is because just before COVID, we were doing Wayang here with Pak Gusti, and and I love how they structure feeling in that Alasa room. But it's also overwhelming because I think the musical textures, I would have to come up with a different way, I think, to talk about that repertoire, because there aren't chalong or katuk or gong, even if there are fewer people to deal with. I think it's I think you'd have to restructure. You'd have to develop a unique mode of analysis for it.
Right. Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Samar Sam, yeah, go ahead.
Andy, hello, how are you?
I'm good, Pa. How are you?
Good. I would like to pick up Matt question about rasa, which is in Javanese actually still difficult how to figure out what rasa is all about. But I happen to listen to Yudana's speech in event to commemorate Pak Brother. And he mentioned about rasa in Pak Brother's composition, and he said something to do with menyusun temuan-temuan rasa. And he has a term for it, gegula. Do you know anything about that? I mean, I tried to figure out, because he said about gegula is an abstract, what is that? An abstract framework. Something.
I don't know, and I feel like Putu, Michael would be better to respond to a question like that. Are either of you familiar with that? I know Putu ran to go get a charger, but I tend to feel that the use of rasa is like in Bali. Maybe I'm wrong, but I always had the kind of suspicion that it was like the use of pelog and slindro.
Well, the way how he explained is that the ability of Pak Brother was the fact that he can put together a piece on the basis of mixing and matching different old ensemble. So that's his take about the temuan rasa.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've heard that way of describing Pak Brata's compositions before, like this expert, really tasty use of the palate.
Yeah.
A kind of expert use of the pre-existing ingredients. But yeah. I see a note about this in the chat.
Oh.
I think gugulat means size.
Size? Oh, I
don't know.
But one more questions about kajar, because you mentioned about it. I wish that Javanese gamelan also has kajar, but no. but this kajar is on the it's not all of the ensembles use kajar, right?
Yeah, right. I mean,
lambatan is sort of like in fact, like a Javanese gamelan, the lambatan and all small old ensemble is so. How you account for the fact that it's not all has a culture type of things?
Well, I was specifically looking for those recordings, ensembles that do use them. But even in Lalambatan, where they're using in the open structure, like the complete, right? As the tempo speeds up, you tend to get Kajar Katuk functioning at that density level. And in smaller ensembles, well, you don't have it in Gender Wayang. Batel, you would have it, you would have tawa tawa or some kind of metronomic metronome, fast pulse marking instrument. But it would be interesting to look at the pengawa, to look more at the pengawa of large sections that don't have that fast periodic pulse. You would probably have to just peg it to something like the chalong. Balongan. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks.
Andrew Timur, did you want to jump in with a comment? I may have passed you earlier up. Let me know if you want to jump in.
Hi, Matt. Thanks. No, I just was just a side comment about Balinese addressing the issue of time, and there was a comment by Andrew and perhaps Michael about Javanese players playing or American players playing Balinese in a Balinese group. I've had the opposite experience, and of course, the Balinese player is invariably ahead of the beat, no matter what happens. So that was my only comment. It was interesting observation based on personal experience that I've had. But as some people may know, I'm mostly involved with contemporary music and Sundanese music. So, of course, that tends to fall somewhere in between. So this is of interest to me. But that was only a micro comment in this discussion.
I don't know if they do it very much now, but EC Kokar SDSE solo used to play Balinese music maybe more often than they do now. And I remember hearing recordings, and that Pa'al was on those recordings. I don't know what year this was. Maybe Pat Sumarsam knows, but the Balinese say, "Oh, Javanese music is slow and boring," and they pretend to go to sleep, and the Javanese kind of go, we've all seen this kind of stereotype. And I remember hearing recordings of that SDSE solo playing, and they were playing Pelagongan, and it was really, really good. I mean, it felt very Balinese to me. So I don't think there's anything essential and immutable about the genetic disposition about timing structure between Bali and Java.
Right. In my experience, it had nothing to do with genetics, but to do with experience and practice.
Yeah.
The players that I'm thinking of that joined a Javanese group that I was involved with were Canadians, by birth. So, but they were steeped in the Balinese culture. So, when they came to sit in, it was very difficult for them to kind of be where everybody else wanted to be in their timing. It took a long time. Anyway, it was striking how the difference in the feel it was manifest in real-time performance. And I'm sure that's other people have had the same experience. So just wanted to say it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
We have a question. Do you have time for like one or two more? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, cool. We got Jody Diamond is up next.
Hi, Jody.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Okay. So I have a question about the physical location of time. I've played more Javanese music than Balinese music, and sometimes when I sit in a Balinese group, this happened with Komen, and I played the gong where I thought it went, and he said, "You're late." And it's like, oh, all right, I'm late. And sometimes I feel like I'd rather play Javanese music than Balinese music because I like the flexibility and the interaction and not knowing, responding to each other. I don't play kendang, so I don't get to that level. I joined the Bard Gamelan when I moved here, and Nyoman Suwaden was teaching it, and I can't really play fast, so I ended up playing katuk, and I found my favorite instrument because playing katuk or kajar or kumpli, there's lots of different names for it, is totally responsive. If that's all it is responding. So I was really happy. But then he would always say, "You're late, you're dragging us back." And I would think I was playing on where I could feel the beat. And what changed was I noticed that in Javanese music, I feel the beat kind of like in my solar plexus, like you're leaning back against time and it's kind of holding you up. And what I did was I moved my sensation of where the beat is up to here. And I felt like time was here, and then I had it. And that was always the problem. If you said you're playing late, it was because I was locating my sense of time down low, like I would say, you're pulling on the reins of a horse. But once I moved my visualization or my sense of time up here, then I was in the right place. So I'm just wondering if anyone else has that kind of way of visualizing where time is or how you connect to it physically, if you do it in different parts of your body. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I feel like I know exactly what you're talking about. It's not what I was talking about earlier, and it would be a really interesting, maybe totally impossible topic to follow up with Balinese musicians. But when you say this, and I think about it, I know exactly where my body, where I feel my body when I play the different instruments. And when I play katuk, I feel it right there. And when I play kendang, I feel it right there. And when I play kanong, I play from right there. Maybe it's just you and I that are totally strange in terms of embodying time in that way. Or maybe more people embody or experience musical time in that way. I've never had a teacher in Bali say, "You need to move the time up to your, to your chest. Your time's too much in your stomach." I've never heard anything like that.
No, well, he didn't say that. He just said I was playing late, and that was the solution that I found. I talked to him about it, but partly because if you do play both Javanese and Balinese music, the physical sensation of what time is doing to you is so different. But I don't think Balinese music is like ahead of the beat. I know what it is. It's like, here's a beat. And in Java, you play so far at the back of the beat that if you played any later, you would slow down, but it's just before that. And Western music, I think, tends to play at the front of the beat, dun, da, 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 da. And Balinese music, to me, is like right in the middle, like leaning forward. You wouldn't think one beat can have so many places in it. But that's the way I've conceived of trying to feel where the time is in these different kinds of music.
Yeah, I would say we're kind of a strange group here in Richmond in that we play Balinese music. Kind of like Samar Pegalengan is our thing. We do some Kibiar, but we're more successful at Samar Pegalengan. And we do Gender Wayang. And then we do that for about half a rehearsal. Then we go to Javanese. And so in every rehearsal, it is this kind of physical, like, playing Kangser on the Chiblun does not feel like you're playing the same instrument. They're shaped the same, right? But it just, the feeling of the time and the way it's structured is very, very different. and experience that over and over again in one rehearsal kind of gives up.
Yeah. Well, you had this great expression when you posted to the Gamelan listserv the other day, where you said, "We like to play slow Balinese music and fast Javanese music." And that, I thought a lot about that. That was really interesting.
Apparently nobody can find that Nardo Sabdo piece. I keep looking for it. Anyway. Thank you, Michael.
All right. Doesn't look like there's anything else jumping in here. So I want to say thank you, Andrew, again.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. And I hope everybody stops by on Wednesday. We have a great lecture on Wednesday with Putu and Ayu. They're going to do a co-lecture on what it's like to work, from different locations across oceans, literally, when collaborating on working on some new work. So that should be really interesting. And actually Sundays is TBD. So we'll see what happens for next week, Sunday. But wish everybody a good night. Check out Nusantara Arts website, like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, etc. And see you around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Matt, for all your great work.
Thank you very much.